in just a few moments from now, the man that you will see on your screens is John Gladstone. There you have it. He was one of the largest slave owners in British West Indies. Gladstone acquired large sugar plantations in Jamaica and Demerara. From Liverpool, Gladstone operated throughout the British Empire, trading corn with India as well as sugar and cotton with the West Indies. Along with his brother Robert Gladstone, they extended their business in the Caribbean, purchasing plantations and enslaved Africans in British Guiana. The largest was by the name of Vreedenhoop estate in Demerara, which was worked by 430 enslaved people. The Demerara Rebellion of 1823, which was a massive slave revolt, actually happened on John Gladstone's plantation. We will now try to put out some of the photographs of the people that John Gladstone enslaved. Interestingly, Mr. John Gladstone, the man you see on your screens, was awarded a payment as a slave owner in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery in 1833 with the Slave Compensation Act of 1837. Gladstone's claim was the single largest of any recipient made by the Slave Compensation Commission, and he had the largest number of slaves. He owned 2,508 slaves in British Guiana and Jamaica and received a whopping over £1 lakh in payment back then. After the abolition of slavery, John Gladstone sought indentured laborers from India to work on his sugar plantations. Knowing that a number of Indians had actually been sent to the island of Mauritius, which was then a British colony in the Indian Ocean, as indentured labor, Gladstone expressed his desire to obtain some of this Indian labor for his plantations in the West Indies in a letter that was dated 4th of January 1836. The conditions, we've been told, as per historians, imposed on some of these indentured laborers was so appalling that they fled in large numbers, and this so-called experiment of Mr. Gladstone of having employed indentured labor instead of slaves was abandoned. Imagine being one of the largest slave owners and then actually getting the largest compensation for freeing other human beings that you once ruthlessly enslaved, and then also bringing indentured labor onto your plantations and keeping them in such poor conditions that they too had to flee. They had nowhere to be. Now, John Gladstone is the father of a former British Prime Minister, William Gladstone. Today, Charlie Gladstone, the great-great-grandson of John Gladstone, who was a slave owner, spoke at the University of Guiana. His speech was interrupted by protesters with placards at the back of the room, but Mr. Gladstone still proceeded to read from a prepared statement despite this protest. He said, and I quote, "Slavery was a crime against humanity and its damaging impact continues to be felt across the world today. It is with deep shame and regret that we acknowledge our ancestors' involvement in this crime, and with heartfelt sincerity that we apologize to the descendants of the enslaved in Guyana. In doing so, we acknowledge slavery's continuing impact on the daily lives of many, but we believe we can have an impact on the world in which we live, and in apologizing for the actions of our ancestors, we hope to work towards a better future." We quickly listen in to what Charlie Gladstone had to say.
Guyana. We, the undersigned, are descendants of Sir John Gladstone, 1st Baronet of Fask and Balfour, and we wish to offer our sincerest apologies for his actions in holding your ancestors in slavery in Demerara, now Guyana. In so doing, we acknowledge slavery's continuing impact on the daily lives of many. We understand that we cannot change history, but we believe that we can have an impact on the world in which we live. And in apologising for the actions of our ancestors, we hope to work towards a better future.
So there you heard it. That was the great-great-grandson of a man who was not only the largest slave owner, but also someone who got a lot of money once slavery was abolished as compensation, and then went on to, as you can see on your screens, employ Indians as indentured labor on his plantation. Some of those photographs are on your screens. While a promise today has been made by Charlie Gladstone, we don't know what reparations really mean, whether it's going to be financial, whether it's going to be psychological. What really does that mean? We try to take this conversation forward with our experts. I have with me Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, outside with me Ambassador Suresh Goyal, we have Adit Kothari, Rashmi Samant and Professor Madhav Nalapat. Let me begin with Professor Nalapat. Professor Nalapat, I'm sure you've also, of course, now read some of the details of this story. This man, Charlie Gladstone, making an apology on behalf of his great-great-grandfather. In a way, yes, this is the first step, of course, as we've been saying for a very long time on NewsX as well, that in such situations, at least acknowledging the wrongs of the past is the first step.
I quite agree with you that it is the first step, and I'm glad that Charlie Gladstone has done this. And Charlie and Caroline, his wife, both of them are known, frankly, for a lot of humanitarian activities. And when he says that he feels sick and at what has been done in the past, I think one has to say that one has to believe that he's sincere about it. The fact is that, we look at the lotus flower. It blooms. It blooms in the most difficult circumstances. And now you look at the Indian community in Mauritius, look at the Indian community in Guyana, and see how that community is blooming. It suffered a lot, it went through a lot, and may I say I'm so happy that we are discussing this today, because the 60th anniversary, if I recall, of the March on Washington by Martin Luther King. And when Martin Luther King came to India, he said, I don't come to India as a tourist. I come as a pilgrim. I come as a pilgrim. Why? Because this country has taught me so many things. And Gandhiji's non-violence was a central part of his creed. Look how far the African American community has come. You have Kamala Harris, who is the vice president, who's, I'm very happy to say, half Indian and half African American. And before that, you had Barack Obama, who had 2 terms in the White House. And he was elected by a majority of Americans, which means the majority of white Americans also elected him. So times are changing, there's no question about it. There have been terrible injustices done in the past. When we go back in history, when we go back in time, those injustices are there, and the point is to move on from them and to learn from them and to ensure that they're not repeated, because that is the important point. The important point is not to constantly just look at the rearview mirror, but look forward and make sure that what happened in the what you could see in the rearview mirror, the horrible deeds, the atrocities, will not take place in the future. And I do hope that with the multicultural Britain, which incidentally has a Prime Minister who is ethnically Indian, a gentleman by the name of Rishi Sunak. So I would like to say, I would like to hope and be an optimist that I think this is a good gesture on the part of Charlie Gladstone. And if I'm not mistaken, his wife Caroline had come to see Lakshmi and me with some friends of ours from the UK in Trivandrum many years ago. And I'm delighted, frankly, that he has made this this public speech. And I think it's important for this to be, if I may say so, everybody to understand the real history of what took place under colonialism. And we have all seen, for example, the horrors that were perpetrated in Europe by Adolf Hitler. The same horrors were perpetrated in other parts of the world by the very countries that claim to be giving freedom. Winston Churchill said, Indians do not deserve to be anything other than slaves. And it's the same Winston Churchill who talked about the Atlantic Charter and about democracy. Democracy for a few, slavery for the many. That kind of hypocrisy, frankly, had to be exposed, and I'm very glad that a member of the Gladstone family has done so.
Absolutely. But at the same time, Professor Nalapat, how crucial is it for everyone involved, perhaps people whose families were also involved in some of these atrocities, for them to actually understand the impact, the generational impact that slavery and indentured labor has had on several communities, rather than simply making statements? Because as you said, times are changing. So a lot of times we also see that a lot of these statements are made just to be politically correct, because this is the sort of atmosphere that we live in the world of social media, that you want to make these sort of statements to at least, rather than it just being a box to tick that, okay, I've made this statement and at least I've made an acknowledgement. What more is required to be done so that people, especially people in Europe and America, actually understand the impact, the true impact that the actions of their forefathers have had on the rest of the world?
Well, I think that's a very good point that you raised, Devika. And I think that underlines the fact that what we need, as you correctly said, is action. Is not just talk. Now, so far as Charlie Gladstone is concerned, I have friends who know him very well, and from all that they say that he is genuinely an individual who has put all these, horrible thoughts about what I may call, a vertical world order, that you've got people are superior, people are inferior, and he understands that we are all, in a sense, equal. We may be different, but we are equal. But others, we don't know. And you're perfectly right. A lot of people talk a lot of what is regarded as politically correct, and then they act in a politically incorrect manner. So yes, I do believe that we have to judge through action, and I do honestly believe that we have to see the action being taken. And there again, I'd like to repeat, the fact that the Conservative Party, not the Labour Party, mind you, the Conservative Party, the members of Parliament of the Conservative Party elected Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister, I think something has changed in Britain. There's no question about it. A lot more needs to change. We have seen, for example, what happened to one of our panelists, somebody whom I admire a lot, Rashmi Samant. The way, she was targeted. But of course, she was targeted by a very clear lobby, if I may say so. And I am happy that Sunday Guardian exposed that lobby within 72 hours of her targeting. And I'd just like to say, Rashmi has, picked herself up and done the country proud, and just, basically shown what we in India are capable of, what humanity is capable of. So let me say, I am an optimist. And I think Charlie Gladstone, I'm glad that he said this, and I'm told from his friends that he said it because he believes it. But yes, there are people who say things that they don't believe. But I think the good news is, in today's age of the internet, today's age of the World Wide Web, you can be exposed very quickly. Most of us can be exposed very quickly if we say something and do something else. In other words, if we are hypocrites.
Absolutely. Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, you've had your hand up, sir, so I'll let you make your point before I ask a question.
No, it was just to compliment Professor Madhav Nalapat for what he had said. So I agree with that, and I want to state that when I was the ambassador for India in Cambodia, the question of the Khmer Rouge tribunal being activated was being pushed very, very strongly by the Western world, to the extent that one of the Western countries' ambassadors went to the Prime Minister of Cambodia and threatened him in a one-on-one meeting that if you do not get this Khmer Rouge tribunal immediately functional, we will stop all aid, not only from our country, but we will insist that the entire Western world stop all aid to Cambodia. The Cambodian Prime Minister naturally was absolutely furious, and I was one of his closest inner circle people and advisors. So he asked me that he wanted to declare that particular ambassador persona non grata and ask her to leave the country within a matter of 48 hours. So at that stage, I suggested to him that the better course for him to follow would be the following 2-3 things. First, talk to the Prime Minister of the country concerned to suggest that he was going to do that, take that step, and whether the Prime Minister would want to do something on his own. So immediately that Prime Minister responded that we will recall her within the next 2 weeks and in a different way. So the announcement was soon made that she was being called back to headquarters to be considered for some other important assignment, and she had to leave in a very big hurry. Now, for me, what did it mean? I wanted it to be a level playing field for Cambodia. So I told the Prime Minister that while the Western world may be demanding this action of Cambodia, but for the Cambodians themselves and the future generations of Cambodia, the earlier generations of Cambodia which had suffered at the hands of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, it would not be a bad idea to proceed ahead with the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. India was the first country in the world to announce $2 million support for the Khmer Rouge Tribunal after my discussion with the Prime Minister. And I said that you must also demand from the Western world a lot of support for setting the legal system into place in Cambodia in terms of training of the judges and the lawyers. So all that was done, and the Khmer Rouge Tribunal started. But
Yes.
I wanted to point out also the Western world hypocrisy in the sense that they can demand that of the poorer countries by putting a knife on their throat, but for their own ills, what they have perpetrated in the world, like slavery and the genocide of the Red Indians in the US, genocide of the African Americans in the US, in Canada, in New Zealand and Australia, there is no real accountability. So what I would like this to be a point of trigger for a lot of other actions to follow, where not only the Gladstone family, but the Churchill family, the Macaulay family, and all the other families also start apologizing, so that there is pressure on the governments of those countries, including to come to a point where there's discussion about returning the loot of the Western world from the colonized countries, like the Kohinoor, for example.
Yes.
That becomes a legitimate course of action to follow.
Okay.
Thank you, Devika, for bringing up this topic. Back to you.
Absolutely, and I'll come back to you in just a moment, sir. But Ambassador Goyal, just like to understand from you as well, what keeps some of these families from actually apologizing for what's happened, at the hands of their ancestors? Because yes, we understand that you can't change history, but an apology really is the first steps towards at least acknowledging that something horrible has happened at the plantations and the lands that were owned by your ancestors. And it seems as though a lot of these people of the current generation from these families of slave owners have no idea of the sort of atrocities that actually took place. The situations in which Africans were enslaved, the situations in which indentured labor, not just from India but from other parts of the world, was also kept. It seems that they don't know.
Devika, thank you very much for giving this opportunity. In fact, I have been really itching to give a history lesson here, and I hope you will be patient with me, just like my friends on the panel and the viewers. Devika, I've spent 8 years of my diplomatic career dealing with South African issues. In that context, I have dealt also with the Indian indentured labor on the sugarcane fields in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal. I have also dealt with the atrocities committed on the black population in South Africa. I have also heard about atrocities, not physical atrocities, but the mental atrocities committed by the Indian people on the black people when they were in South Africa. It's legendary. You talk to any black people in South Africa and they will tell you how Indians treated them worse than the whites did, because we had our own caste levels, we had our own religious connotations. We were much more fragmented society. Not fragmented, multi-layered society, so to say, where in fact if you went, every person represented one layer. I have been to Cambodia. I know what happened there. I have been to Vietnam. Vietnamese don't talk about the killing fields in Vietnam, but they remember it. My point really is, as a matter of history, how many apologies are going to be enough? Yes, we need apologies, and I'm not denying that. And I'm very happy that Charlie Goldstein has tendered the apology today. Very good. Let me recall many other instances really. Do you know that the grandfather of Rabindranath Tagore, whose name happened to be Devendranath Tagore, was a trader in opium from China? And basically, because the opium trade was the cause of the opium war, will their family apologize for being part of the opium war? I don't think so. Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King, they were the bigger Gandhians than many Gandhians have found in India. When Nelson Mandela in 1994 became the president, the elected president, what did he do? The first thing he did was establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what was the job of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Because Nelson Mandela realized that asking for apologies from everybody is only going to break up the country further. There were already divisions between blacks, Zulus, and I forgot the name of Madiba's tribe, but there were so many divisions already. India's whites, etc., etc. He thought of getting people together rather than asking for apologies. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the hearings were conducted by Justice Richard Goldstone, did precisely that. And after the elections, Nelson Mandela, ANC, obviously came the tops. But IFP, Inkatha Freedom Party, led by Buthelezi, was not even second, it was first in KwaZulu-Natal. He appointed Buthelezi as the Deputy Prime Minister, even though there were people who had no votes. Why? Because it was important for him to heal the wounds. I'm mentioning all this. ANC, by the way, ANC is today known as the Nationalist Party of South Africa. But when ANC started the movement for freedom in early 20th century, they were known as the terrorist parties. They were the people who were involved in the Sharpeville bombing attack, where more than 200 people had died. Are you going to call them today and call them to apologize for what they did in Sharpeville?
Okay.
PLO, Arafat's party. Today, we don't even talk about PLO. Why do you think the United Nations was not able to define terrorism? Because whenever we came to talk about terrorism, Arafat said, but our party is a nationalist party. We are fighting for freedom. And in that fight for freedom, we need to use guns. What are you going to do? Call them to apologize for using the guns? Devika, the point really here is we need to heal the wounds. Apologies matter, they don't matter. But I think the great thing here is that here Charlie Gladstone realized that the past has to be forgotten. Past has to be forgiven. And we need to move forward. And what is more important is while we keep learning from the past, but we keep in mind the future.
Okay.
There is Rishi Sunak. Can you ever think of having a British again as the Prime Minister of India? Or forget British. Can you ever think of having a Muslim as the Prime Minister of India? So I'm giving all these examples, and there are many more things. But the point is, it's a great day that he has apologized. But I think the important thing is that just like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, bring the people together. Today.
Okay, but Ambassador Goel, how does an apology not bring people together?
Just one second. Today the problem is that even in the USA, despite Martin Luther King, people still look at the society in terms of black and white.
Yes, they do. And an apology would help perhaps the people of America educate themselves, right? When somebody apologizes on someone's behalf, don't you feel that they would actually be able to educate themselves and understand? slavery may have ended centuries ago, but we see the ripple effects continuing till date.
Devika, I'm afraid I've seen world. I assume that you are younger to me, but I've seen much more of the world, and I can say with some confidence that apologies do not lead to learning.
What leads to learning then, sir?
What leads to learning is the realization that wrongs happen and those wrongs need to be repaired. Unfortunately, apologies, despite the apologies of the past, they don't always lead to making amends, changing things.
Okay, so when we talk about reparations, let me bring in Rashmi into the conversation. Rashmi, what really then is a logical reparation? When we say, okay, let's forget about apologies, they don't matter how many people will you make apologize. How do reparations then happen? If there is no acknowledgement of a past wrongdoing, how do you even have a conversation about reparations? How do you make people understand that the way blacks are treated in America today actually is a result of centuries of slavery and centuries of discrimination?
Well, I think honestly, to be fair, by looking at how societies work now, I feel like the strongest sort of dictator of terms in society is marketplace. Who runs the marketplace and ultimately decides who gets respect and who doesn't get respect. I mean, for all we know, the speech was being made at Georgetown in Guyana. The Guyanese president for the past 2 terms has been an Indian. It's been, a person of Indian origin, Bharat Jagdeo. So somebody who's had, an indentured past. So when you come to a country where the president is, a symbol of atrocities of the British, you can't really be making a speech that is anywhere non-apologetic. So you need to start with an apology in those cases. I honestly feel that a lot of these sort of sudden realizations and apologies are somewhere seated in the fact that the formerly colonized, the formerly indentured have all come out of their circumstances, out of their own, merit, hard work. It's thanks to, no thanks to, the colonizers. It isn't their kindness that made any of us or any of, the sort of formerly indentured successful. Everybody did it on their own. I mean, Obama has had his own struggles, and it's no thanks to the system per se. But I think this apology is now something that it's the minimum that they need to do to even have a seat at the table. Otherwise, people are straight up going to stop inviting them to all of these places. So the more powerful we become, the more the marketplace is non-Western, dominated by the non-Westerners, and the more the Bharat and the formerly colonized do assert their identity, their success. I think that's the only way that we can truly begin to heal and rewrite history in the way that we want to. I still remember when I ran for president at Oxford, I ran on a platform of decolonization. It was all the rage. People loved hearing about it. But then when I finally did become president and I came up with a plan, okay, ABC, we're going to do this, we're going to change the syllabus starting tomorrow, then things hit the ceiling and they didn't want me as their president anymore. So, I've seen this come full circle in my own time, the sort of sheer hypocrisy of the apologies they make as well, and the sort of, trend that they try to hop on to look good, to, kind of apologize for their, ancestors and kind of try to pretend like they're not like their ancestors. They're exactly like their ancestors. They just want a seat at the table and they're willing to apologize, but nothing more. And I think that is very unfortunate. But I think as formerly colonized, we also need to have the maturity to understand that this is not going to solve any of our problems. The reparations are not coming. Even if they are symbolic scholarships set up via, and by the time we see a penny or a pound come out of those so-called reparations, it's going to be far too late for us to, kind of pause our growth story expecting, this to play an active role in our growth. I think it's about time we seize the opportunity. We do the right thing. We don't do wrong things like they do, but sort of focus on our growth, and then the respect, the apology, the, rewriting of true history, it will all follow.
Okay, Adit Kothari, let me bring you into the conversation. Rashmi's raised some, pertinent points there, but often we're told that schools in Britain don't even teach British history. People are completely in in the dark of what has happened. So in this day and age, how do you then seek what should be the logical reparation? Because like I said, how do you do monetary reparations for so many people, right? We're talking about lakhs of people across the world whose families, whose ancestors were either enslaved or went abroad as indentured labor. Across the Caribbean, you would see, across South America, you would see now Indian families who are doing really well for themselves. Their forefathers went as laborers, but they've managed to now move away from that and they've made a place for themselves. Of course, they're doing better. But does us doing better mean that we just forget about the past, we don't ask any questions of the past, or we simply accept that, okay, this apology is not going to make any difference anyway, so why ask for it?
Thanks, Devika, for having me, and congratulations for being voted as the best news channel. Quite rightly so, when you talk about British schools, there is a sense of historical amnesia which is sort of crept in, where not a lot of the past historical atrocity, at least from the colonial era, is essentially taught in those schools, spoken about, or even discussed. But we shouldn't restrict this to only British schools, for example. I mean, India is a case in the making where I think whitewashing history has been the bane of our civilization for the past 75 odd years. I mean, when we look at enslavement in medieval India, for example, there has been no mention about it in any of our history books. But when we pick up a book like by K.S. Lal, which talks about enslavement in medieval India, we find 2 million Hindu population was completely wiped off during the Ghazni period, and the prime targets at that point were predominantly women of breeding age. Some say that Firoz Shah Tughlaq, even in peacetime, collected about 180,000 slaves across his empire and converted them to Islamic slaves and eunuchs. Akbar the Great, in 1564 abolished slavery in his empire, which was rightly done. But a gentleman named Abdullah Khan Uzbek, who was an officer in Akbar's court, he imprisoned almost 5 lakh slaves, and he quoted saying that, now since I have collected these slaves and I have sold them in the slave market, I will essentially go to heaven. So these are the kind of things that we are not taught in our history. How long are we going to be whitewashing our history with the hope that, there are no fishes going to creep up within our societies? Eventually the Pandora's box is going to open up. These will have to be debated. And the whole point of having a truth and reconciliation session is to acknowledge that there were ills of the past. We cannot do anything about it now, and we need to look at the future. But the point essentially being, at least we need to start by acknowledging these ills of the past. And that is what the Gladstone family has done. Quite rightly so. I don't think the apology in this particular instance does much good to those indentured laborers and the families of those indentured laborers. And reparatory justices, as Rashmi also mentioned, although we acknowledge it, I think there was an estimate that Britain almost owes about $1.3 trillion, I beg your pardon, to families of the Caribbean indentured laborers. Obviously, they're not going to see a dime of that. But at least there has been an acknowledgement that wrongs had been done. With our population, beyond the colonial history or the colonial era, there has been no acknowledgement of the ills that we've had to suffer at the hands of the medieval rulers. We can say that they came and they became us, but that is not a solution, or that is not a justified statement that we have heard for so long. Not so long ago, in 2015, when there was the debates held in Oxford Union, Dr. Tharoor gave an absolutely awesome speech. Right after that, there was a BBC article that was printed in which Professor John Mackenzie, who was also part of that particular debate, and he said that reparations to India is something that Britain does not owe because we've given them much more. And what is the logic that they often use? They use the logic of unifying India in a common language of English, giving India a railways. So those are the kind of anecdotes that people still use. That is where the problem essentially lies, and that is what needs to be targeted and dismantled.
And at the
Thanks,
same time,
Devika.
Professor Nalapad, why should we not be raising these issues? What Adat has said, and we've also heard this argument so many times, that the British gave so much to India. No, you took so much from India. When you say you gave us so much, what do you mean? And we see the reason why one feels that an apology or an acknowledgement is important today is also because we still see the sort of racist mindset, sir. I mean, we've managed to land on the moon, and you still see the sort of articles that are coming out. That are making fun of India. They're saying that, oh no, India, oh, you know, why doesn't India return so much so in aid that was extended by the British? That's the reason why you want an apology and an acknowledgement.
Well, I'd like to agree with you, Devika, and the reality of the situation is that, for example, the fact that this partition took place, the fact is that we, you know, our history books, basically they forget that, almost they try and just forget that there was a partition. And I have said for several decades, and if I may say so, a word that's very unfashionable, secular. I have been secular, I am secular, and I'll continue to be secular. And I, as a secular person, have been saying for more than 3 decades, look, the 3 holy sites of the Hindu community, Kashi, Mathura and Ayodhya. Please send them back to where they were before Aurangzeb destroyed them. Aurangzeb destroyed the Mughal Empire with his intolerance, but the reality is he destroyed Kashi, Mathura and Ayodhya as well. And these are the 3 holy sites. This is where you have the birthplace of Lord Ram, of the birthplace of Sri Krishna, you have, you know, the Shiv Shakti. And from that point of view, it's not like any of the other 40,000 or not houses of worship that were desecrated. No, only these 3 matter. But when you I remember when I raised this issue 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago, 5 months ago, oh my God, what are you saying? Absolutely not. How can you say this? It's terrible that you say this. For heaven's sake, you know, I perfectly believe that every faith is entitled to its major religious sites. And, you know, in India, the Sanatana Dharma, the Hindu community, have only these 3 sites. And even the return of these 3 sites has been basically just pushed under the carpet. The fact that there was a partition pushed under the carpet. The reality is, I can tell you, that this kind of a situation just leads to a reaction. And that is where the truth is always an important thing. Satyameva Jayate is basically the national motto. I think we are Indians, we are mature people, and I'm proud to say we are all Indians, irrespective of the religion that we belong to. We are all Indians. We may be Hindu, we may be Christian, we may be Buddhist, we may be Muslim. It doesn't matter. We are proud Indians. We have all, we all celebrated when Chandrayaan landed on the south pole of the moon, and we all stand together for this country. But I quite agree on that. And may I point out, the hypocrisies. African National Congress. I'm grateful that Ambassador Goel mentioned that. India, and by the way, the USSR, now Russia, these two countries supported the ANC all through the period when the ANC was being hounded and persecuted. And may I say that hounding and persecution took place, and Mr. Nelson Mandela continued in prison against the wishes of India, expressed many times by the same countries that are now celebrating him. And so that is a very important point. I'm proud of the fact that I'm Indian. I'm proud of the fact that we stood by the ANC. We stood by the Palestinians in the time when nobody stood by them. We stood by them. At the same time, we made it clear that the state of Israel is a friend of India. The Jewish people are friends of India, and we're not going to sacrifice those friends. So please, don't do anything at the expense of others. Do something that benefits you. Now, coming to Cambodia, for example, Pol Pot was a ruthless dictator. He killed many people. What about the bombing of Cambodia ordered by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger? How many hundreds of thousands of Cambodians died as a consequence of that bombing? B-52 bombs. More bombs were dropped on Cambodia than during on Germany during the Second World War. Is there no accountability for that? Is it only Pol Pot? Was it Pol Pot who ordered the B-52s to launch bombs in Cambodia? I don't think so. And today you're seeing Ukraine. I mean, the whole Western world is going crazy about the situation in Ukraine. People are dying in Ukraine. It's tragic what's happening in Ukraine. There's no question about it. But many, many, many more people than Ukrainians who have been killed are being killed in different parts of the world. And the very countries that talk incessantly about Ukraine, that basically, try and preach incessantly about Ukraine, they don't say a word about these deaths. They don't say a word about these people.
Absolutely.
But they fling money into Ukraine, and that kind of money, if they had flung 10% into the poorer parts of the world, they would have made hundreds of millions of people benefit. But they've not done that. So yes, there is hypocrisy. It needs to be called out. The good news is, even in these countries, it is being called out. I mean, Devika, my latest book on Cold War 2.0, it's published by Penguin. It's a British publishing house. I'm not sure that with my kind of viewpoint on all these matters, I would have been published by a British publishing house maybe, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So
yes.
Times are changing, Ambassador.
Professor Nalpa.
Absolutely. Okay, Ambassador Goyal, yes.
No, I just a brief remark.
Yes, Ambassador Goyal, go ahead.
I was saying that Penguin is now an Indian publishing house, so there's nothing to worry about on that score. They can't not publish a book. But Devika, since I've taken the floor only, just give me 1 or 2 more minutes, and I'm going to be and with that. History is a very difficult judge. You cannot trust history to be accurate judge, because history will judge things in the context of today's perspective, not the perspective of the times when the history occurred. Recall Europe, if Germany had won the Second World War, the history of Europe would have been written very differently. I'm not justifying anything, but I'm only saying that it is not always possible to judge acts of individuals on the basis of history.
Okay.
We have to basically see the context in which that particular act occurred and whether those acts have changed or not changed against today's beliefs, today's notions, today's political, economic requirements. So from that point of view, change is always welcome. We welcome the change. But to keep condemning people on the basis of what they did in the past without knowing why that happened and how it happened and was there any other way, etc., can sometimes lead to difficulties. That's all I'm saying. Therefore,
okay. But, when that argument, Ambassador Goyal, when made in the context of, say, a war, one can still understand. But as far as slavery is concerned, how can you say that, oh, they don't know what context it was happening in and why it had to happen? Was there any... Yes, of course, there was a better way of treating human beings. So I don't see how that logic really then, holds as far as enslaving people or keeping them in very poor labor conditions is concerned.
I agree with you, Devika. But please also realize that when the Indian indentured labor was taken to South Africa, they required labor for sugarcane fields. Work on the sugarcane fields was very, very hard work. No justification for the conditions. Those conditions were difficult. But that was also the opportunity for those people to make a living. They would not leave their villages. If they didn't find, there were people who were actually captured and they were actually brought in illegally. Fine. Therefore, let us not look at everything in the context of slavery. And please remember, at that time, in the 15th century, in the 16th century, slavery was unfortunately an acceptable practice. I'm not condoning it, but the fact is, for those people, they were not committing a crime. Not
Ambassador Goyal, I mean, there came a point, right, where someone woke up one day and realized, okay, what is going on? How can you treat other people like this? How can you tie them up and beat them up and whip them and lash them?
That's the
So to
reason I
say
said-
that they were not committing a crime, it does then whitewash history. And that becomes problematic then. But Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, I'm running out of time. There are some updates from ISRO that have come in as well that we have to reflect. But Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, how do we have this conversation without always being told that you can't look at things as black and white, because there was a lot of context and there was a lot of, there must have been a reason, because somehow I can't get myself to understand, and we've read, right, we've managed to, because of what our ancestors have gone through, we've also managed to read then African history or other South Asian history. We've exposed ourselves to that because we want to know what happened in the world. So we know the sort of conditions that people were kept in, the way that they were, go to Zanzibar and you hear the stories of how they were actually dragged, chained, starved, because the white man saw them as some exotic animal, some exotic creature. These men and women who are much larger than them in size, you know, at the hands of your guns and your pistols, you enslave them, you whip them, you make them work in the heat, you don't feed them properly, you don't pay them. And that's not even, that's the least, I guess, of the worries of the people who were enslaved. But when they today probably hear these sort of statements, their next generations, that, oh, there was a context and at that time it was not a crime. So the people who were actually whipping another human being were not thinking that it's a crime. That has to hurt.
Devika, I agree with what you have said. And I compliment you for having these views and for the NewsX channel to be discussing this very important issue, because in my opinion, sensitizing the current generations and the future generations to what has happened in the past is very, very important. A narrative had been created by the Western world. Now, when you talk about whipping and all that, it didn't stop there. It is auctioning these people as if they are, just some items of furniture or whatever, and being treated like non-human beings, being given a number, not the name, not being allowed to carry their names with them. So the extent of slavery and the atrocities is just too vast a field, and for people not to realize these aspects. And we have been fortunate to work in different parts of the world and to get into some of these granular details and understand them and reflect upon it. Now for South Africa also, the ANC, I was directly involved in the mid-80s with huge amount of shipments from India of medicines, educational material and armaments through Tanzania, through Morogoro, which then used to be shipped across to ANC. A lot of the ANC leaders were Indians. So the Indians supported the freedom movement very, very strongly. That is why they had a good stature in that society. About the Indian situation, I am a secular person from the beginning. We are trained like that. We are authentically secular. But to be given a false narrative, like when I appeared for the IAS exams, having studied at the IIT and done engineering, there were hardly any subjects in engineering which I could take as my optional subjects. So what did I have to choose? One of the subjects which I chose was the Great Mughals, Indian medieval history. And what was I told to read? Books by people like Rumila Thapar and Irfan Habib, which whitewashed its history completely. And I'm glad Adit has pointed it out so beautifully that, that is a narrative which was created. There were hardly any atrocities, according to these authors, in spite of documented history, committed by any of the great Mughals, and Aurangzeb was marginally at the edges of committing some crimes like killing his own brother, Dara Shikoh, killing his sister, killing his family people, jailing his father, etc. So that was a history which was taught only late, and I believed it because I was told to study that sort of syllabus. It was only later that I realized how much whitewash had been done and what is the actual narrative had been put under the carpet. Now, without sensitizing the current generation and the future generations to what has happened in the past, how do you prevent that sort of thing recurring? So, I think it's very important. The true narrative has to be communicated. People have to be sensitized, not only the current generation, but the future generations also. Because most of us do not understand what has occurred in the past and how to deal with it in the future. So it is a very important thing what you say, and Devika, I absolutely agree with your proposition that these are very, very important issues which have to be brought to the front burner absolutely, and the people have to realize. And one of the ways that the discussion and reflection will happen is through such steps which are taken by some of these families. Back to you, Devika.
Absolutely.
Thank
And
you.
leave the last word with Rashmi. Rashmi, how do we then have these conversations without seeming like, or without having to apologize in a way for the fact that we are stuck in the past? How do we take these conversations forward? Because like I said, for someone whose family was enslaved, someone whose forefather perhaps died on a plantation field, they don't really, I don't think they sit and care about the fact that, oh, back then when the white man was whipping and lashing and starving my great-great-great-grandfather, it was not a crime.
Well, I think history is brought up no matter what, and it plays a very essential part of our present, because like it or not, it is always used to justify something or the other. So I think as somebody who belongs to a beautiful civilization that has never employed such methods in the past and has always had a dharmic perspective on life, I think we can afford to be on the moral high ground where we define these things as crime, because it's a two-way thing. So I think we need to do what's best for our civilization, our people and our community, because it's going to be brought up no matter what in debates just like that of Chandrayaan. And we need to have points, otherwise we are just going to, despite coming so far along on our own, we are just going to look stupid by the end of the day. And all our achievements are again going to be whitewashed and credited to the former white man who so civilized us, who claimed to have civilized us and given us science, technology and education that put us on the moon. So I think it's about time we take the reins back on narrative and try to hold our ground for as much as possible with truth, with compassion and consideration for our community and the wider community.
Absolutely. I leave everyone with their last thought of Rashmi's, and I thank all of our panelists for joining us.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.